Thank you, Jim. Thanks for your kind words, and thanks for inviting me for a second time to give this lecture tonight. Right, now, there we go. 3 years ago, after the Glasgow COP, you invited me for a lecture, and at that time, you might remember, I was saying we're moving in a different phase of the climate debate, and I said the focus is now shifting away from the science and shifting to the cost of net zero and the cost of climate policies. And within 3 years, this really has truly materialized in a way perhaps much faster than even I anticipated. It's clear now that people are much more concerned about the cost of net zero policies than the potential of climate change. The climate alarm, although it hasn't died down, is no longer trusted by huge chunks of the public. The climate scientists have overplayed their hand. They've basically caused so much partisanship, censorship, and intimidation that they've lost the trust of the public by and large. But today I will talk about the issue we are now facing in this new phase of the climate debate or climate movement, and that is we have seen numerous governments who have been pushing and campaigning on climate alarmism for the last 20 years, falling by the wayside, losing elections. And we have new governments, of course, in the US, but also in many European countries, and soon perhaps also in Canada, possibly, who will have to decide what to do with a climate and energy policy agenda and how to deal with the unintended consequences of 20 years of what I would call self-destructive eco-socialism. But before I do, perhaps because this is my last lecture as director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, I will be retiring at the end of March. I will stay on as a trustee of the foundation, but no longer directing or managing the GWPF. But looking back at where it all started may give us also a good idea of just how foolish governments around the world have been in the last 15, 20 years. And these are the other things that I will look at: the net zero disaster that we've feared and warned about for many years, which is now unfolding in front of our eyes, and the implications of the victory of Donald Trump and his policies, and whether they will succeed and have long-lasting impact. And then we're looking at how some governments and even the EU are beginning to roll back policies that were kind of all-party consensus for a long time. We're looking at the split in the Labour Party, which is only going to deepen. Briefly at China, and then how governments can really get off the hook. And the main problem I can already say here is that even governments who promise in their manifestos or, before election that they want to reform and they want to change policies are being shackled, not just by the swamp, by the bureaucracy, by the civil service, but also by the courts and the lawfare that is being adopted by campaigners. So we'll have to look at that. Here are the kind of different styles of how to get governments off the net zero hook. We have the Trump style, the Millet style, the G7 style, the EU style, the UK style, the Canadian style, and the Aussies who basically they're not there yet, but they'll get there eventually. Okay, so 15 years ago, on the 23rd of November 2009, Nigel Lawson and myself, we launched the GWPF in the House of Lords in the run-up to Copenhagen. That was the plan. But a few days before we launched, something weird happened, something that was named Climategate. The kind of leaking or hacking, we don't know still up to today exactly how the emails were stolen and how they were then leaked. But what was evident ever since is that the climate science community was not playing a fair game. They had their foes, they had their critics, and it's quite clear ever since then that any skeptical scientist had a very hard time. They were either sacked or suppressed, their papers not published. And this has led to the mistrust in the public about climate science. Nowadays, in a way, climate science has self-destructed in that it is no longer an open and fair and unbiased, critical and self-critical venue of research. It is a highly politicized group of scientists who have an agenda, and that shows in the loss of trust and kind of loss of interest in hyped up climate alarmist headlines. And then, of course, we had the Copenhagen COP, which was another milestone, historical milestone. I'll come to that in a minute. And the reason was, and my first op-ed I wrote just in the aftermath of the COP15 in Copenhagen, you'll see basically I said that the failure of COP15 to come to a legally binding agreement was not only inevitable, it was also predictable and predicted. And I said right from that very moment that we started the GWPF that the whole agenda would never, ever materialize, would never, ever achieve its goal, because the interest of the West, the Europeans and Americans on the one hand, and the developing country on the other, that division was irreconcilable. And that has materialized today, that it's clear that the developing world will never accept legally binding targets, that the West essentially is decarbonizing unilaterally, and that, by the way, this COP was also the origin of the BRICS alliance. Some of you may remember that the agreement in Copenhagen was essentially drafted by 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Obama had to gate crash the meeting of the BRICS to get into the meeting to basically tell them, okay, I agree to, I don't want to be isolated like the Europeans. Remember, the Europeans were not even invited to the group who wrote the Copenhagen Agreement. So what we've seen since then is the complete and utter diminished role of Europe in the geopolitical shift. power shift. And Copenhagen was the milestone that led to this new alliance of emerging and developing countries and the West basically becoming more and more isolated on this issue of energy. And remember, in those days, before cancel culture, we were invited to debate with Ed Miliband on the BBC. I was invited to write for The Guardian or The Observer, or invited for a debate with one of their science writers. So that's how it started, and it didn't last very long before people like, this conservative minister, Greg Barker, saying, oh, the BBC is giving too much time to invite skeptics. They shouldn't really be on air. And, lo and behold, the BBC eventually decided that they shouldn't be invited at all. We shouldn't be invited at all. And Nigel was banned essentially from the BBC, and the BBC became, like many other news outlets, propaganda tools, only basically allowing one side of the argument to be interviewed or to write pieces or to be involved in any programs. That's the situation we had for many, many years, and only really in the last 2 or 3 years, this has changed completely. A result of the rise of alternative media, social media. Of course, Twitter or X has made a huge difference, but there are also other media outlets and news outlets who've made a big difference. And then, of course, we've seen 15 years of one climate disaster prophecy after another, prediction after prediction. Most of these predictions, of course, never materialized, despite rising temperatures. All of these predictions failed to materialize. There isn't a single extreme weather event with catastrophic consequences that has increased in recent decades, despite the fact that temperatures have continued to go up. Just as an example of the last 15, 20 years, almost on an annual basis, we hear, that the Atlantic Ocean current is going to slow down or even eventually stop, and that we are facing another ice age here in Northern Europe. And of course, then scientists who measure these things figure out that nothing much has changed in the last 60 years. Anyway, what about temperatures? Yes, temperatures have risen very slowly and about half as much as the IPCC originally predicted. The IPCC, remember, in its first report predicted global warming rise of 0.3 degrees per decade on average, and it's about half of that. So yes, warming still happens, and as long as it happens, the climate alarmists will shout fire, but it happens much more slowly and much more gradually, despite the headlines. The trend is still only half of what the IPCC originally predicted, and who knows what's going to happen. I'm a complete agnostic on that. But the reality is that more people now are much more concerned about net zero and the deindustrialization of Europe as a result of net zero. The climate alarmists are really on their own. They have a few allies like Extinction Rebellion and some hardcore eco-socialists. But apart from that, most people are, more than half at least, are more concerned about the policy costs than the climate agenda, and the surveys show that. So the Europeans have put all the eggs in one basket, the net zero basket, and almost everything they have proposed and almost everything they have implemented is falling apart. There is not a single policy, net zero policy I can think of that is going according to plan or is going at all. Whether it's heat pumps, whether it's battery factories, whether it's EVs, I mean, you name it, whether it's aviation, you name it. There is not a single policy that is working. Okay, so Europe has managed to reduce its CO2 emissions primarily by shifting industry abroad and importing most of its, goods and stuff from abroad, so they can say, well, look, we are emitting less, and who cares what we're importing? But in actual fact, if you add all the stuff that is imported from China and other Asian country onto the carbon footprint, there is not that doesn't look that well, and so it's as I said, highly self-destructive and also delusional to think you can do that on your own. We also have to realize that many of these policies, which are basically command and control policies, this is not done because people want heat pumps or want EVs. It's because the government dictates what people are allowed to produce or allowed to buy. It is pure and utter eco-socialism, top-down command and control. It's almost like in the old Soviet Eastern European kind of economies where the government decides how much can be done, how much can be produced, what can and what can't be produced. And of course, these policies lead to economic disaster and industrial disaster, and the European car industry is facing an existential crisis as a result. China, of course, is the elephant in the room in terms of CO2 emissions. If anyone is concerned about CO2 emissions, it's China overtaking the EU in terms of overall emissions, not just recent, but overall, China has now overtaken Europe as a bigger historical emitter of CO2 than Europe and is soon going to challenge the US too. But in the meantime, China is a developing country officially under UN rules. China can do whatever they want. They don't have to adhere to any binding targets because they are, and they claim to be a developing country, and they say they will be always a developing country. That's the official Chinese position. We will always be a developing country. What it means is, as a developing country, you're exempt from all these kind of net zero targets. And yes, well, they might say by 2050 or by 2060 or by 2070, we might, but they say a lot and they don't have to adhere to it. And then the Greens say, well, look at China, how many wind farms and solar farms they've built. But it's a drop in the ocean in the overall thing. Basically, China is free riding on cheap coal, and they're burning coal as if there's no tomorrow. And they are not going to stop burning coal. Mind you, even the Germans are going back to coal because they've, switched off the nuclear power plants. Coal is at a record high, despite 20, 30 years of climate alarmism. Global coal consumption is at a record high, and there is no end in sight. Remember, when I wrote this piece in 2010 about the Copenhagen COP15, I was saying, energy demand is going to double by 2050, right? Primarily in the developing and emerging world, energy demand is, and that was before AI and the rest of it. So in a world where energy demand is doubling, the idea that you can give up on coal and gas and oil was just completely delusional. However, China is free riding. They are producing electric vehicles and solar panels and what have you for half the price of what the Europeans can build. And of course, what it means is Europeans can no longer compete on these issues with China. Of course, they are saying the EU then say, oh, we have to put tariffs on the Chinese products. Well, you have to put a lot of tariffs on Chinese cars to make them uncompetitive. But the Chinese are saying, well, you put tariffs on our cars, we'll put tariffs on your cars. So, and China is a huge market. And what it means if you give up on cheap coal and cheap gas and bank on expensive and unilateral net zero policies, here's the result. Basically, electricity prices are going through the roof. Your industry is basically becoming uncompetitive. European industries are no longer competitive. Their energy prices are 2, 3, sometimes 4 times as high as in the US or in China. And for the first time, we've seen the EU now admitting that they can't continue business as usual, that they have a problem. And more EU officials and politicians are saying we have to roll back the whole net zero agenda. In Europe, it's called Green Deal. But that's what they're saying. We cannot continue because we have shot ourselves in the foot. And as a result of becoming more and more unpopular, you have the rise in these populist parties. In lots of countries, they are not only big, but in some countries, they are the biggest party, like in Austria and in Italy and in Hungary and so on. These parties have railed against these delusional policies for a long time. And as a result, people are voting for them. And the European election was the last sign of the rebellion of voters against the green agenda, the net zero agenda. And then you have, of course, Trump 2.0. We've had Trump before, and he did a lot of drilling. Mind you, Biden himself did a lot of drilling, although he tried to prevent many parts of the country and many parts of the world to prevent drilling. But the US did a lot of oil and gas, particularly shale gas and shale drilling and exporting and using, which makes energy so cheap in the US. And a lot of industries moved from Europe to the US and even from China to the US because they are such a highly competitive, cheap energy superpower. So the problem with Trump has is that we all know that he wants drill, baby, drill, and he wants more oil and more gas and more coal out of the ground. The question is whether, despite his announcement that he will withdraw from Paris Agreement, and probably Milei will follow him and others might follow him, the problem is, and this is the problem every government in the world, in particular in the Western world now faces, is can they make a difference? So we've seen in Europe politicians, even French politicians, saying we have to delay the green rules. I mean, never mind the Paris Agreement. If, whatever happened to Paris when the Paris politician urged Brussels to delay EU green laws, and green rules, we have a problem. And Tusk, another very eminent EU leader from the center left, railing against the Green Deal. And so there are new priorities. Of course, the war in Ukraine has focused minds, and the EU has to shift more spending to defense. There's also the pressure of Trump. And there's a real risk that if the Europeans can't get their act together, they will hemorrhage even more power and influence, not just globally, but even within Europe. So there is huge pressure now on the EU to roll back net zero. It's much more difficult because it's difficult and not difficult because in the EU, many of you may know that Parliament doesn't play a role in EU policymaking. No one cares about what the European Parliament says or votes or so on. All these things are being done by the EU Commission and the heads of state. So this is now the big question. How do you actually roll back policies given that you've introduced all these net zero laws and targets? Same problem in Britain. The government is in a big pickle. The economy is sinking fast. It's never mind growing. The government fears that there will be a recession, and they basically are split now on the whole net zero agenda because the chancellor is saying growth at any cost, anything else is secondary, and net zero is in the way. So we'll have to watch this space, but it's a big, big headache for the government. It's a big headache for the EU. And Trump, who has won a landslide victory, faces a difficult challenge. And the challenge is that he has a mandate. He won an election. He has a majority in both houses. And still, the climate activists can go to the courts and say, look, there are these laws, they are enshrined in law, and therefore Trump can't do what he wants to do or what he has a mandate for. This is the biggest challenge for Western democracies today, is that even if they win elections with a mandate and they say in advance, this is what I want to do, they get elected, and then the left and the eco-socialists go to court and stop them from doing it because of the laws and the environmental regulations. So here is the biggest hurdle for governments to get off the hook is the inherent net zero laws, the inherent climate laws, the inherent targets, the carbon budgets. The only way you can actually get off the hook effectively is by changing the law. And that is more difficult than said because many parties in the Western world, perhaps less so in the US, but in most Western countries are split. Not just, the mainstream, but also on the right, the center-right parties, the conservative parties are all split. They all have very strong green wings who will join their political opponents if they. We've seen it here in Britain with Rishi Sunak. When he was prime minister, he pledged to start fracking and get the shale gas out of the ground. And the Green Tories said, we will vote with Labour against fracking. So he had to cancel that. So Trump 1.0, he never managed to overcome that hurdle. And the so-called endangerment finding, which basically says CO2 is a pollutant and it's a dangerous pollutant, wasn't really touched. The EPA, the Trump EPA, never tried to overturn it. And so now the Trump 2.0 is trying to go down that route because without changing the law, it will be very, very difficult to put in practice what Trump has basically done through executive actions. So we've seen that he's declared an energy emergency, which allows basically the federal government to overrule any kind of state intervention. He's halted the kind of green handouts for the green lobby, for the green swamp. I mean, part of the whole net zero and climate agenda is just a money grabbing, lobbying, and subsidy farmers trying to get as much money out of taxpayers and governments. So he's halted the 300 billion handouts to the green blob, but he faces lawfare, climate lawfare. There's a few months ago, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to the EPA's endangerment finding. The endangerment finding, which is basically the main law preventing a US administration for going all out for drill baby drill, says that the administration is bound by this law and can't take action because CO2, as I said, is a dangerous pollutant. It's dangerous to human health and it's dangerous to the planet, and therefore governments have to curtail any energy policies that the environmental lobby thinks goes against this law. So Trump will have to face that problem. My good friend and colleague Francis Menton, who is the president of the American Friends of the GWPF, has written extensively about how it can be done. Go on his blog, Manhattan Contrarian. He's written extensively and has tried in the past to overturn the endangerment finding. It's a complex law, but unless you basically get rid of it, it will be difficult for even Trump, with all his mandate and a clear public mandate and electoral and democratic mandate, to overcome this. So lawfare, climate lawfare, is a very potent opponent of energy and climate realism. But he says that it can be done, and the way he thinks it can be done is to actually challenge the science. Not the science that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and not the science that CO2 might contribute to some warming, but the science that says that warming is that CO2 is a pollutant, which is rubbish, we know is rubbish, and B, that global warming is causing all these extreme weather events. That's what he suggests, and we will have to wait and see how the Trump administration deals with the endangerment finding. Of course, you can roll it back like Milei does. First of all, start fracking in a big way. So Argentina here is fast becoming the Texas of Latin America because of its huge shale deposits. I mean, we have huge shale deposits in the north of England, but we are not touching them. So we are not using the wealth under our feet. Again, he might face the courts over a number of issues. We'll have to wait. Of course, the G7 has a different tactic to get off the hook, and that is basically to say there won't be any money unless China gives up its developing nation status. That in itself will become the topic of the next few COP meetings, the UN climate summits. There won't be any money coming from, forget the US, but there won't be much money coming from other G7 countries unless China gives up its free riding role, which is a very powerful argument for not continuing unilateral decarbonization. And that is basically the European exit strategy, put an ultimatum to the Chinese and say, unless you give up this free riding developing nation status, we will change our climate laws accordingly. We will no longer be fooled into unilateral decarbonization. That makes no sense, because whatever Europe is doing, or even the US is doing in terms of cutting down on CO2, is overwhelmed by the Chinese and other Asian nations emitting CO2. So is there a exit strategy? Well, I would argue the biggest challenge is to find a parliamentary majority to change the law, to revise the Climate Change Act or repeal the Climate Change Act. But unless you repeal and change the law, it will be difficult to get off the hook. And that's basically the challenge many governments now face. Right. So after 15 years of telling people that this is not going to work, that it will end in tears, that energy reality and net zero don't go together, I think we are now at a situation for the first time when politicians are knocking on our door, policymakers knocking on our door and saying, please help us to get off the hook. We need ideas and policy alternatives to get off the hook. That's where we are. And I'm pretty sure that my successor will have a much easier time in his role, and the GWPF will have a much easier time, and the Irish Climate Science Foundation will have, and Clintel will have an easier time than in the last 15 years, because we are now essentially saying what the vast majority of people think and want. Thank you very much.